Hello, everyone. Just going to give a second for everyone to be able to click in and be loaded onto the webinar here. Welcome, all of you. Okay, welcome. My name is Kevin Gallagher. I'm the director of Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, or the GDP Center, as we like to call ourselves. Our mission is to advance policy-oriented research on financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the world. We have 4 research initiatives at the center, and one of them, one of our signature initiatives, is called the Global China Initiative. And the mission of the Global China Initiative is to advance policy-oriented research that analyzes the social, economic, and environmental impacts of China's global economic presence. Today's a real special day here at the GDP Center, not just because it's the last of what has been 12 different seminars that we've done on China's global economic engagement over the semester, but it's the culmination of a year's hard work by many people at the GDP Center. A year ago, we were asked to put together a global data set on China's overseas development finance. And today we're really happy to showcase the 4th in a series of open interactive databases on China's overseas economic activity that we have here at the GDP Center. And today's data set is referred to as the China's Overseas Development Finance Database, or the CODF, as I'll refer to it from here on in, and my colleagues likely will as well. My colleagues, who I'm about to introduce, will go into much more detail about the data set, but the CODF tracks overseas loan commitments by China's 2 policy banks, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China, from 2008 to 2019, and spatially locates, in terms of their longitude and latitude, those projects within those data that are spatially located. As my colleagues will note, some finance has been allocated for open-ended budget support to a country like Ecuador. Obviously can't locate that project, but we've located the projects that are locatable. The accompanying interactive that we'll also showcase for you today allows users to examine the proximate location of these projects relative to biodiversity areas and indigenous lands. The GDP Center is part of a small but growing group of researchers across the world attempting to estimate China's global economic reach. While the world's 2nd largest economy enjoyed a current account surplus of 10% of GDP about a decade ago, it really unleashed global dollar loans and other assets across the world. Coupled with the figures that you can see from balance of payments, there was lots of anecdotal evidence of what this presence was looking like at the ground, but there was no real hard data to be able to connect the dots between those 2 things. Without that data, there's, as folks say, why let the facts get in the way of a good story? There were lots of narratives written about the impacts of Chinese overseas economic activity without much data to support them. And a number of institutes and researchers across the world have tried to fill that gap so folks can have more of an empirical based understanding of these issues. And the GDP Center sees ourselves as part of this growing group of folks trying to do that. It really goes back to the first movers were at the Paul Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies, what is now called the CHEXIM, or the China-Africa Research Initiative. Those were the first group of researchers that tried to estimate what Chinese overseas presence was in Africa. And then Derek Scissors at the Heritage Foundation and now at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington also has built a database that one can regularly look at across the world in terms of foreign investment contracts and other things. We tried to mimic the double verification method close to a decade ago as well with our friends and colleagues at the Inter-American Dialogue, and created and now published on an annual basis something called the China Latin America Database. Using that same methodology, we have now published for a number of years something called the CGEF, or the China's Global Energy Finance Database, which allows folks to look at China's energy finance. In October, we released something called the China's Global Power Database, which is through a different methodology. It's an algorithmic approach through a global database of power plants and allows folks to look at Chinese development finance and equity in power plants so one can find out more about their technology and their emissions. There's been a number of other excellent global efforts that are going on now. CSIS in Washington, their China Power Project, publishes a lot of information on infrastructure. MERICS in Europe, and of course the first and most comprehensive global estimates are from a group at the College of William and Mary here in the United States, and most recently researchers in Zurich, Carmen Reinhardt, formerly at Harvard University and now at the World Bank, sort of aggregated all of the existing data to try to put together the first comprehensive data set of Chinese overseas finance that went all the way from 1949 until a few years ago that is recent. And we see ourselves in this broader family of other institutes that are trying to figure all this stuff out. My colleagues will go into much more detail about our method and explain the basic trends, do a demo that'll help you see some of the main features that you can use to be able to work on this. But all of our colleagues, and I think our counterparts in all these other institutions will admit that this effort is an art, not a science. Like many of the other databases, because of this, we will update this regularly. Not only will we be looking for new projects, but we will go back and revise ones that get canceled or that never really came to fruition. And we, as with our other databases, we ask you for your help. Our colleagues will note that there's a little toggle where you can go and actually tell us about a project that might not be there, or tell us about one that got canceled, so that when we're updating this on a regular basis, we can go back and double verify what you suggest and go take a look. I should also note that a lack of transparency about this kind of economic activity is not limited to China by any means. Yes, it is true that some of the international institutions like the World Bank, like the Asian Development Bank, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, are very transparent. You can go to their webpage, download all their projects, and even you have their spatial location. In fact, many of the scientific papers that we've submitted to journals based on the data we're going to present today compares to some of those open source geolocatable sources that are out there. However, many of the other national institutions that have institutions that are analogous to the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China are very untransparent. And I should say, starting with the United States, OPIC, which is now the DFC, very hard to put together that data. The United States Export-Import Bank, very hard to put together that data. We've had to go through similar efforts to do that. We also have work coming out that compares to Japan, very untransparent on the Japanese end. And one of the most perfect comparisons is the KfW in Germany, but their data is so untransparent that's even harder to put together in the way that we did here. I think it's important to just to note that in its comparison. Well, this has been a major group effort for over a year, and I'm going to turn it over to two of the folks that have been playing a leading role on this here at the GDP Center. One is Dr. Rebecca Ray. She's a senior economic researcher here at the GDP Center in the Global China Initiative and in the Global Economic Governance Initiative. And also Dr. Blake Simmons, a postdoctoral researcher here working on this project in particular and a number of applied studies here where we're looking at these data and its impacts on biodiversity and indigenous lands. These folks will speak for about 25 minutes or so. And afterwards, we'd like to have a global conversation with all of you about it. If you notice in your bottom right-hand corner of your Zoom, you'll see a little Q&A button. So you can click onto the Q&A button and please introduce yourself, tell us your affiliation, and type in a question. And then I'll field those questions for our two speakers today after they have their presentation. So let me please turn it over to Rebecca and to Blake, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and good morning to all of our attenders, or good evening to those who are in the Eastern Hemisphere. As Kevin said, we will be introducing today our latest data set, the China's Overseas Development Finance, which is a geospatial data set for analysis of biodiversity and Indigenous lands in particular. Blake, could you take us to the next slide? To start with, we'll introduce what the dataset includes, give you a few key findings from it, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Blake Simmons, who's a conservation biologist, to talk about some of the geospatial implications. How are these projects, this portfolio of projects located with regard to sensitive territories around the world? And then we'll give you a behind the curtains look into the methodology, how we put this project, how we put this data set together, and why we hope you'll be able to feel a very high level of confidence about every record that's in it. Next slide. A basic introduction to the dataset is that, as Kevin Gallagher said, it covers every sovereign loan from China's two main policy banks, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. We look at these two in particular because, as policy banks, their mission is to support China's economic policy rather than other public Chinese banks, which also play very important roles, but who have distinct missions to follow commercial motivations. We look at a timeline from 2008 to 2019 to capture time before the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative as well as afterwards, so that researchers who use it can look for pivot points or changes around that time. And as has been mentioned, it's geolocated with a high level of precision. This actually makes it the first data set in the world among this wonderful array of great data set tools that are already out there to really try to bring together all three of these features. A methodology that we call double verification that can be applied globally, which means we want researchers to be able to have the highest level of confidence possible that we stand behind every record in the data set. A broad timeline that allows for analysis from several years before the Belt and Road Initiative, right up to the end of last year, and geolocation with a high level of precision and transparency so that researchers really can feel free to use it and know exactly what the data reflects. Next slide, please. All in all, this data set includes 858 loans, accounting for $462 billion. But as you can see here, I have distributed across what types of geolocation is applicable to each of the loans. How does this loan portfolio interface with our ability to map the projects? And as you can see here, a large chunk of these loans, 193 loans for $192 billion, are in those white sections off to the right, meaning these are projects without geographic footprints in particular. They might be general budgetary support, they might be trade support for importing Chinese goods. But within the filled in sections, the red, pink and red bars, the vast majority of them, in fact, over 90% of them, 92% of them, are able to be located either at the exact location, within 25 kilometers, or at the municipal level. Those three categories, exact, within 25 kilometers, and the municipal level, that's what you'll see on our online interactive mapping. Those are the projects that we can map with a high enough degree of confidence for geospatial analysis to be able to be done precisely. And that will give us yield 615 loans that Blake will explain how to use on the online interactive when we get to that point. Next slide, please. We can already pull certain key findings from this data set. If we look at the entire set of loans, as I said, the entire sets of loans, those with and without footprints, that brings us to $642 billion over this time period. How does that compare to the world's preeminent and traditional development finance source, the World Bank? It's on par. The World Bank, between its two windows that give sovereign loans, has issued $467 billion, so nearly the same amount. But as this chart shows, the World Bank's lending has been much more steady over this time period because Chinese development finance, like all bilateral development finance, whether it be from KfW, as Kevin Gallagher said, or from China or from any other source, is ultimately about a relationship between two countries, which means it can be expected to ebb and flow quite dramatically as the needs of those two countries evolve. So China was able to mobilize a tremendous amount of support for developing countries during the 2009 global economic crisis. And as you'll see here, it continued to grow after 2013, after the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, it began to grow again. But in the last few years, as China's growth has moderated and slowed, it has slowed as well. It'll remain to be seen how China responds to the global economic crisis brought on by COVID. But I hope this gives you some sense of how much finance we are talking about. Next slide, please. When I said that China was able to extend financial support across the developing world, it's actually more accurate to say it's extending development finance support across the entire world. Here we break down the amount of commitments to countries around the world. And as you can see, it really is dispersed globally. Asia, the Americas, Africa, even Europe with a heavy presence of Russian borrowers. But a few countries really dominate. We have a few countries who are frequent borrowers, Venezuela, Pakistan, Russia, Angola. The top 10 countries make up 60% of China's global overseas development finance. So we're hoping that this geolocated data set will be particularly useful to researchers who can then use it for regionally and nationally and locally important projects and analysis. Next slide, please. In terms of sectors that have been funded through this finance, Chinese DFI is often referred to as an infrastructure powerhouse. And in fact, the Belt and Road Initiative is often framed as an infrastructure initiative. And our findings really support that. As you can see here, the top 3 sectors, transportation, extraction and pipelines, and power generation and distribution, comprise over 3/4 of the entire portfolio. So China has established itself as the leading bilateral development funder, finance source in the world, as well as particularly in infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. Now, as we've said, this data set is geolocated, which allows for a particular kind of analysis. And for that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Blake Simmons, a conservation biologist, who will be able to walk us through what it offers and how you can use it.
Thanks, Becky. So China's overseas development finance can certainly bring significant economic benefits, but there's also the potential for significant social and ecological risks. And our database highlights where some of these risks may be present based upon the project locations overlap with 3 key social and ecological features that are particularly sensitive to development activities. So first, we included national protected areas, which serve as an important political and ecological indicator of risk, as development within protected areas may violate guidelines or commitments by lenders or the borrowing country. And given recent concerns about the effectiveness of the existing protected area networks to achieve our global conservation targets, placing additional risk within these park boundaries may further jeopardize these conservation areas that are meant to serve as a refuge for biodiversity. We also included areas defined as critical habitats according to the 5 criteria within the International Finance Corporation's Performance Standard 6. These areas are an important and representative ecological indicator of risk that incorporates features like key biodiversity areas, irreplaceable protected areas, threatened species, and key habitats like forests and mangroves. And finally, we incorporate mapped territories known to be managed or controlled by Indigenous people. Indigenous communities face similar direct and indirect risks from development, as well as additional threats to health, livelihoods, cultural and spiritual practices, and even potential conflicts over territorial or human rights violations. So based off of the locations of projects financed by Chinese policy banks, represented as things like points, such as coal-fired power plants, lines like roads or pipelines, and polygons like extraction sites or agricultural fields, we identified which projects overlap entirely or partially with any of these sensitive territories, as well as those with no known overlap with any of these territories. And of the 615 geolocated projects in our database, we found that 261 are within critical habitats, 124 within national protected areas, and 133 are within Indigenous peoples' lands. Overall, more than half of the projects financed during this period overlap with at least one of these sensitive territories, and nearly 1 in 4 projects overlap with more than one type of sensitive territory. So how about we see what this looks like? I'm now going to hopefully successfully transfer us over to our interactive map of China's overseas development finance. And this is all live and available to you now if you would like to join us live on your screen, but I'll walk you through what this data set looks like and the features that are available to you. So on the left is a legend, which allows you to select specific types of loans based on their overlap with the 3 types of sensitive territories. So you can view projects within indigenous lands, critical habitats, national protected areas, and all of the projects where there are no known overlaps with these sensitive territories. And you can also select background map layers to show one or more of these territory types, such as indigenous peoples' lands, critical habitats, and national protected areas. On the map, the markers are shown in colors of purple, red, green, or gray colors, or some combination of them. These colors indicate each project's type of overlap corresponding to the colors in the legend. Purple for indigenous peoples' lands, red for critical habitat, green for national protected areas, or gray for projects with no known overlap. Markers with more than one color indicate projects that overlap with more than one type of sensitive territory. For example, the Orinoco oil production in Venezuela includes all 3 colors because it's located within critical habitat, indigenous land, and a national protected area. In the legend, you can also track the temporal trends of China's lending based upon projects you're interested in. Here you can see the number of projects financed during 2008 to 2019, and you can hover over each bar to get more information. You can also toggle between the number of projects and the amount committed per year by selecting this toggle button here. And you can also interact with this graph based on projects overlapping certain territories. For example, if I'm just interested in all of the projects overlapping indigenous peoples' land, you can see the graph updates to show the amount of loans committed each year that finance projects within indigenous lands. And you can modify this as you wish by selecting other types of projects. By scrolling down, you can see a list of all 615 projects with information for each one, including the types of overlapping sensitive territories. Clicking on a particular project allows you to see where it is on the map. And if you hit this globe in the top right corner, this will send you back to the global map. Now, hovering over these different projects brings up what we call a tooltip. And this allows you to see the name of the project as well as the year, amount, lender, and sector of each project. For linear infrastructure, like this road upgrade here, you can see that the tooltip gives you the length of the project in kilometers. For projects that occupy an area of land, like this oil field that I mentioned earlier, as well as dams with reservoirs, mines, or agricultural fields, the tooltip also shows you the area of the project in square kilometers. Projects are shown with one representative point each. So for example, the South Atlantic Interlink project here is a very ambitious project, envisioning over 5,000 kilometers of undersea cable between Cameroon and Brazil, represented by just one central point on this map. The territory overlap shown, in this case, critical habitat, is for the entire length of that project. And you can compare 2 projects simply by clicking on the first project. That lock icon in the top right corner of the tooltip will turn black once you click it. And this means that the description is now locked in place, allowing you to compare it to other projects, maybe like this submarine cable in Papua New Guinea. Once you click a project, you also have the option to view in list. And this will take you down to view the project in the table where you can receive more detailed information on it. Another useful function that may be relevant to stakeholders interested in particular regions is the ability to restrict the table to areas that you're particularly interested in. For example, if I'm interested in projects within Indonesia, I can zoom into the region by clicking and dragging and centering Indonesia, clicking on this zoom icon here, or even using this selection tool to specify the exact area that I'm interested in. I click and drag, and it shows me where I'm interested in. Once I've focused the area on the map of my interest, I can go down to the bottom of my screen and select this toggle button that says Show Projects in Visible Area Only. Now, if I go down to the table, it has been updated to show all of the projects just within the map view that I can explore further. And if I want to go back to all of the projects, I simply toggle back to Show All Projects. And now the table updates again. For 75% of the projects included in this database, these markers are based on the exact locations of the projects. For the remainder, these markers are based on our best estimates, given some level of uncertainty regarding their exact location. 20% of these projects have been mapped within 25 kilometers of their true location, which Becky will talk more about in detail shortly. And you can identify which projects have higher location precision by looking at their descriptions. So I'm going to focus here on an example down in Angola. So you can see this irrigation canal construction that we have here. The central point is shown, and this has been mapped with exact precision accuracy. However, this road project next door is represented by a central point that we know is within 25 kilometers of the true location of the project. And you can see that this marker includes both a note in the description, as well as a corresponding 25 kilometer buffer surrounding its location to give you an idea of that scope. And of course, if you want to learn more information about this database, the About page offers additional information, including definitions and sources for the 3 types of sensitive territories covered, as well as an email submission form to receive relevant updates for the project or to contact us with any questions or suggested projects to include. And finally, we also have an FAQ section for frequently asked questions that you can search through here if you have any questions that arise. So that is a quick overview of the features within this interactive database. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Becky to discuss more about the methodology behind how we obtained this spatial information.
Thank you, Blake. As Kevin mentioned at the beginning, we are entering into it and have been participating in for several years, a landscape that is full of a variety of wonderful data set tools tracing Chinese overseas finance and investment from different perspectives and with different specialties in each data set. I want to take a moment to explain the methodology of our particular data set so you understand what makes us unique in this field. And now that you've seen what this data set includes and what you can do with it, I really want you to mostly be able to understand why we hope you and every researcher who might be interested in using it should be able to feel the highest possible confidence in every record that you see and in the geolocation that we have with every project. So what we bring to the table to bring us to set us apart, to make us unique in the field of wonderful tools, is that we try to combine the double verification standard, which we've mentioned a few times and which I'll explain now in more detail, and visual confirmation of every geolocated project. So double verification at the core of our methodology is simply requiring agreement between sources, Chinese official sources, and international or host country sources on the basic characteristics of each loan. We do this because we find that the potential for overcounting or early counting loans is very high in situations where bilateral development finance can be politically charged. Politicians and interest groups always have incentives to mention a loan before it's been completely signed, or to mention it several times as the amount gets changed before it actually gets signed. So by requiring this double verification, we ensure that we're only counting each loan once in the final amount of money that actually got signed in the year that the loan finally got signed. So this is really the core and the center of our methodology. And with this, we really hope that every project that is in here, we can stand behind you as researchers, we as the broader community researchers will be able to use this data set, knowing exactly what you'll be able to say with confidence in your results that you come up with. To walk you through how we apply this standard, up at the top, you can see this first light gray box is called data compilation. And this is the step in which we first bring together the universe of potential projects. As Kevin Gallagher mentioned toward the beginning of this presentation, there are 3 data sets that already meet the double verification standard or exceed it. And these we were able to incorporate without having to do that step to them because we know they've already passed through that process. And those include China Development Finance in Africa, which is managed by the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies' China Africa Research Initiative, run by Deborah Brodegon, as well as 2 data sets that we help contribute to or run ourselves here at the BU GDP Center, Chinese Development Finance in Latin America, which we produce together with our friends at the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, DC, and the China Overseas Energy Sector Finance. Those have already been double verified. A broad array of data sets that each have their own strengths and specialties and are fantastic in their own regard don't use double verification. And so we had to bring up each of those loans, do the research to really only keep the loans that could pass the double verification standard. And of course, those together don't cover every country, sector, and year that's possible. So we developed our own in-house web scraper data collection algorithm process, both in English as well as in national languages of all the countries affected, through our colleague, Joshua Pitts, who's a programmer, to be able to create the entire universe of possible projects, then subject all of the projects that have not been subjected to double verification to that standard, and to keep only the projects that pass that standard to make sure that we can stand behind every record. And this is here, this medium gray box, this working data set that came out of that is 858 finance commitments. Now, you'll notice that we say finance commitments instead of loans. And this is because, as with the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, China Africa data set, we are tracing the year when the financing commitment was made, not the year in which the money actually changed hands, because loans can be dispersed over the entire length of a construction project. For example, it might be dispersed in tranches as a highway is slowly built every 100 kilometers. There may be another tranche delivered, but we are tracing it the year the financing commitment was made. And this goes along with our focus on policy banks, right? Both the year the financing commitment was made and the banks themselves focusing on economic policy should help researchers understand this from an economic policy perspective. And then we come to our geolocation process. In addition to our double verification for the facts of each loan, we require visual confirmation of every geolocated project. So there are existing data sets that have some level of geolocation. There are energy sector data sets specifically run by academic or civil society groups who try to locate power plants around the world. And we developed our own in-house API query for Google Maps. But we took all of that data and our team of dedicated researchers confirmed with visual validation every project that you'll see that's been confirmed at the exact location. Another small section of loans were able to be confirmed within a municipal level. And those that are confirmed at the municipal or better level are the ones that you'll be able to see in the map interactive that Blake showed us. So our final data set here in this black box is all of the loans that we put together and geolocated. You'll see it includes a total that is much bigger than what's in the map, because as we showed you in the map, the mapping process only includes those that we can geolocate with enough precision that researchers who use it will be able to use it with confidence and being able to stand behind their own results of their analysis. So next slide, please. And with that, we would like to open the floor up to questions. You can find this data set at bu.edu/GDP/CODF. So GDP for the Global Development Policy Center, CODF for China's Overseas Development Finance. And we hope that we have given you a solid enough introduction to using this tool that we'll all be able to use it. And we look forward to seeing what you do with it, what the broader community of researchers are able to do with this tool. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Becky and Blake, for that great overview. For those of you who still are struggling with how it might work, both of these folks did a wonderful short blog piece that summarizes the main findings, and it has a little introductory video on how to use the interactive as well. Maybe we can put that in the chat, and you can link to that. As Becky said, we welcome your questions now. I see that we have a number of them in the Q&A box here, and I'm glad to see folks are introducing themselves first. So let me ask, I'll ask 3 or 4 of them of the 3 of us, and then we'll see if we can do a number of rounds. First, I'll start with Divya Narain. She's from the University of Queensland. And she says, question number 1, the IFC critical habitat criteria already incorporates protected areas. Why then have you chosen to look at the overlap with PAs separately? And question number 2 is, how have you visually verified locations of proposed projects? And question number 3 is, how can we get access to the latitude and longitude of the data? So she asked 3 in 1, or maybe I should just stop there. But let me just. There's a couple that are similar to this. I think there is one from our friend Joanna von Braun, which is, how do we identify indigenous lands? How can you be more specific about what the indigenous land data is? I think there was another one that was very similar to that. Emiliano Cabrera Roca asks, does the database's mapped indigenous lands include lands that indigenous people have claims on, but which are not officially titled? So I'll get to some of these others, but since you got a big cluster there, why don't you start with those?
Well, Blake, why don't you start with the geographic questions, and I'll start with the methodological questions when you're done.
Sure. So that first question, thinking about the overlap between protected area considerations in the IFC's definitions of critical habitats and just national protected areas as a whole, Divya is absolutely correct. There are definitely overlaps, specifically thinking about the criteria for critical habitats for especially important protected areas. So what they consider to be irreplaceable protected areas of exceptional ecological or biodiversity value. But what we found whenever we were initially deciding whether or not we even needed to include national protected areas on their own was we found that there actually was relatively little overlap between what protected areas fall into critical habitat designation and which ones do not. So yes, there's definitely overlap between them, but also there's plenty of protected areas that are not classified as critical habitat, whether these are different IUCN categories or maybe more sustainable use areas, so maybe not as ecologically important as a critical habitat. But that's absolutely true. There are some overlaps, but also some differences. And also in regards to identifying indigenous land. So if you go to the database, you'll be able to see our sources for all of this data. And our source for indigenous land comes from a paper by Stephen Garnett and colleagues in 2008. I believe it's called the exceptional value of indigenous people to conservation. And so there you'll find really in-depth methodologies for how they attain this information. But what they did was they did a very large effort to collate as much publicly available information on the mapped boundaries of indigenous territories that they could verify in the literature and on the ground. And so this comes with an important caveat to recognize that there are probably much more indigenous lands out there than what can be verified in reputable and public data collections. So definitely look at this as a conservative estimate, that these boundaries are based on published boundaries that exist, but there certainly are more indigenous lands that could be out there that just have not been verified at this moment. And you can find more information about that on the website.
Thanks, Blake. In response to the other question on the availability of the data, early in 2021, one will be able to download the spreadsheets, not only of the volumes and composition and so forth, and also the longitude and latitude. We're just waiting for some of the scientific papers that we've submitted to journals to come back in. There was a number of questions, one from our friend Regis Meridon. Hi, Regis, thanks for joining us at the French Development Agency. A number of them, how do we locate and define development finance, and how more specifically do we differ from some of the other databases that are out there? I'm sorry, I won't mention all of your names, but there was 4 or 5 questions in that space. I can answer those. We define development finance very similar to what the World Federation of Development Finance Institutions and the International Development Finance Club does, and those are public banks, publicly owned banks, or at least a significant component of the bank is owned publicly. In this case, both of these banks are both 100% public government banks from China that operate overseas with public policy objectives, not commercial objectives. There was a specific question by Meridon of how this compares with the OEC DAC. The OEC DAC has struggled for a while on how to think about these kinds of things, but has undergone a really a whole process now and has something called the Total Official Support for Sustainable Development Finance Framework, which allows one to think of it beyond just overseas development assistance, which this finance is not. In their framework, where these 2 banks would fall under are largely what they call total overseas support and South-South development finance, and they're different in the TOSSD framework. There's some specific questions about specific databases that we might differ from. One of them was, how do we differ from the CHEXIM database? Well, first and foremost, this is a global database and not just Africa. That one is specific to Africa. Secondly, that database is a little bit more in depth in that they look at development finance and they also look at commercial finance, say from the Bank of China or ICBC, and that one isn't geospatially located. But it is double verified. And as Rebecca said, we started with that for our Africa estimates, at least on the development finance end. I mentioned it in my remarks, a group at William and Mary. They're officially called Aid Data. Folks asked what the difference between our data set and Aid Data is. Theirs goes from 2000 to 2014, so we have a 5-year different set than theirs does. They also, like the CHEXIM database, look at development finance and commercial finance by entities such as the Bank of China. Ours, we don't have that in our database. Ours is geolocated. We use the double verification method, and we have a different spatial location method that was outlined by the folks here. Couple other questions here. How do you assess the impact on habitat protected areas, and what are the criteria? I think we'll need some clarification on that. A question from Paulina Garzon, our friend, says, very interested to know if you think this database is going to have spillover effects over the Chinese financial sector. For instance, will it encourage them to be more transparent? Jingyu Gao asks, does the spatial information in this data set only contain to point of interest only, or does it also document polylines and polygons of the projects? Let me just ask one more. Dr. Jingyan Sun of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences would like to know if there's some comparative analysis with other DAC countries or the World Bank. And is there considerations that different projects might have different influences, for example, telecommunications projects, agriculture, et cetera. So maybe you can, I'll hand those over to my friends here, and definitely can talk about some of the comparatives as well.
Sure, I'll start briefly, although I think the vast majority of these questions were aimed at my colleague Blake and from a more geographic perspective. There was one question that was left over from Divya Narayan at the beginning, which was, how do we geolocate projects that haven't been built yet? That is a great question, since we have financing that goes through the end of 2019. Many of those projects have not yet been built. And so to geolocate those, Our team poured through engineering drawings and maps from feasibility studies, from environmental impact assessments, from government reports, to pour through to get as precise of a map as possible. And so when you see the location of more recent data that doesn't have a footprint on Google Maps, for example, know that we have verified that through official documents to the extent possible. Regarding transparency in general, this is an endemic characteristic of bilateral development finance, as Kevin Gallagher said at the beginning. We notice that you may notice that we do not have a similar data set up to trace KfW or other bilateral funders who do not have the level of transparency that researchers would need to be able to do geospatial analysis of them. And we certainly hope that our efforts can contribute to broader transparency in the sector in general. China is certainly not alone in that. China is set apart because of its size and its importance. The fact that it is by far the largest bilateral creditor means that a tool like this will be able to hopefully allow researchers to build an analysis that covers a larger chunk of international development finance. And so we certainly hope that not only Chinese financial actors, but European financial actors and every other development finance actor will be able at some point to be able to share data to the extent that researchers, stakeholders, government agencies, affected communities will all be able to participate more fully and make as wise decisions as possible, which is ultimately our goal here. Regarding comparisons with other creditors, that is absolutely an important thing to do. And so we have, a few weeks ago, some of you may have been at our presentation looking at the data from an upcoming, forthcoming paper on comparing this data to the portfolio of World Bank projects. So World Bank, among development financiers, the World Bank does put out geolocations of its projects. And so we were able to compare this portfolio to their portfolio. And that presentation is on our YouTube channel. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in contextualizing this portfolio based on what other development finance sources are doing to check out that YouTube video on our channel. And you'll really be able to see how the comparison works. And as more data becomes available for more lenders, we would love to be able to extend that kind of comparison analysis across the sector. Blake, do you want to take the more geographic questions?
Yeah, so I've flagged two questions here. Hopefully, I think that was all of them. So one of them, this is the perfect question for the whole purpose behind this data set is they ask, how do we assess the impact of these projects on biodiversity? And that is the core question that we're hoping people will be able to answer with this database. So for us, this database shouldn't be interpreted as some sort of quantification of the impacts that these projects are going to have on protected areas, critical habitats, or indigenous people. So what we've done is just flagged where those risks are prominent based off of cross-boundary overlaps with these projects. And so what's really going to be important and what researchers are going to be able to do now with this database is go into their particular study region of interest and be able to say, okay, how many projects are there? What types of projects are they? Are they roads? Are they mines? Are they power plants? Are they dams? And what kind of features are around them, both social and ecological features are around them, so that now you can sort of do a more proper impact evaluation based off of their unique characteristics in your particular landscape to understand what the realized impacts will be given these risks that we have identified here. So that it's a great question, and what we hope everybody will be able to start answering now when they have access to this database. And along those lines, someone asking, for this database, does it contain things like polylines or multi-points? And the great thing about the data set online is that we show you a glimpse for all of these, long linear infrastructure, and on the polygons, the central point to where they are. But what you can do is through the email submission portal on our About page on the website is you can sign up through the email service to be notified of when our high precision geolocated data is going to be available following peer review. And then that data set contains the specific boundaries of these polygons, the exact path of these lines, and they're formatted in a way so that they contain multi-point and multi-polygon and polylines, so that the user can decide if you want to treat separate locations under the same project as one thing, or you can split them up to consider them as completely separate geographic locations. And so that will be made available once the data has been published following peer review. And to make sure that you don't miss that announcement and that opportunity to get them, you can sign up through the email box on the About page of this website.
Thanks, Blake. We've only got about another 10 minutes, but there's a couple other questions that we haven't addressed yet. Although I guess we didn't address Paulina Garzon's. Can't leave you hanging, Paulina. Absolutely. This is an effort in transparency, so folks can do empirical analysis to have data-driven discussions about policy. But like the World Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the Asian Development Bank, it'd be great if these institutions, it'd be important for these institutions to be more transparent. And as researchers, one of the things that we do in the Global China Initiative is that we try not to just look at China as a monolith, and most of our scientific papers are about this. These issues are always comparing it with one or the other. And we find that whereas the multilateral development banks are really to be credited for their transparency and accountability and sort of ease of downloading of the data so that stakeholders can take a look at what they're doing, it is not the case, as we've said a number of times, but pretty much with all of the capital exporters that are out there in the world economy. And we really urge, not just for the sake of being able to do research, but for stakeholders to be able to hold these institutions accountable to their missions. It'd be really important to make sure that these things are more transparent. Where the Chinese government actually is creating a BRI portal, and ironically, we're working with them on that. So they actually are going to be aggregating other people's data around the world so that folks can get a better idea of some of the environmental impacts. That should be something that China will be launching in 2021. Louis Ma from ISG at the University of Lisbon asks, I guess this is similar, asks, is it possible to know the size and percentage of Chinese development finance in each country relative to other countries' development finance in a particular country? Imagine, say, that we're trying to compare Chinese development finance with European development finance in Africa. The answer is yes, but we're not doing all that work too. This allows one to, you'll have the China development finance data, and say you wanted to compare that with the African Development Bank, you could download the African Development Bank finance and compare the two. You'd have difficulty comparing that with KfW finance, which is very prevalent in the African region. We've done some of that in scientific papers that we've done, but you'll be able to really use these data to be able to compare development finance from China with other MDBs. As our papers come out, we also have data with some of the other ones. We just published a paper with some colleagues at Princeton University last month in the journal One Earth, where we compare the development finance from China with the South Korean Development Bank, the Japanese Development Bank, and the other MDBs in terms of their technology mixes, fossil fuels versus renewables, and then we project the emissions of these different ones. And so there we've done some, and that's an open article. Maybe we can put that in the chat. And the data set is available for that on a Princeton University repository. I think we've sort of run out of time. I really want to thank Rebecca Ray and Blake Simmons And I should just say that these two folks are the senior faces of a project that we were asked to do a little over a year ago. And Rebecca Ray put together a sizable team of students in GIS, Earth and Environmental Studies, and so forth that helped build the data set. And then about 4 or 5 months ago, Blake and some other colleagues coordinated a group of folks doing this work on biodiversity and indigenous lands. So it's been a huge group effort. There's been a number of people involved. I really want to thank everybody that had a role in playing in making this happen within the tight deadline that we had for it. Also want to thank all of you for coming, and we hope this is a public good that all of you can use to, regardless of what kind of a stakeholder you are. If you are a researcher and you want to do research on this and do the kinds of comparisons that Louis Ma just asked about, we hope you do that. And if you're folks like Paulina Garzon, who is working with stakeholders to get better information about how these projects work in order to hold institutions more accountable, we hope that can be a service for you too. So thanks everybody for coming. This has now been quite a great semester on these issues. Since I have you all here, it would be great if I could invite you to the GDP Center's last big public event, which is tomorrow in EDT. One of the biggest concerns in the world economy right now is the access to essential medicines and a vaccine. And we'll be holding a symposium with members of the World Health Organization, the South African government, and experts that we're co-sponsoring with the South Center tomorrow on what reforms are needed in the trade and investment treaties around the world to ensure that developing countries have access to essential medicines and vaccines in the post-COVID era. You can go to our webpage and our events page and sign up for that one. Very important conversation. But until then, as Blake said, please go onto our webpage and or into the chat here, sign up so you can find out more about our Global China Initiative, get on our newsletter, and find out about these events. We're going to have a number of seminars on China's global footprint next semester in early 2021. So let's put 2020 behind us. Thanks to my two colleagues here, and wish all of you a happy new year, and we'll see you next year. Thanks so much.